Anyway.
And we're live with Tom Condon, Enneagram expert. That's my opinion. Enneagram expert. So,
whereas I'm just a buff.
Yes, a buff. He's not. Jonathan is not quite at the level where he wants to call himself an expert. I believe he's an expert, but he doesn't want to call himself an expert.
Yes, it's because when we were starting out these Enneagram videos, Ben tried to call me an Enneagram expert, and I kept saying no. I was afraid that people like Tom would sue me.
In fact, I think a way to start this off might be, Jonathan, if you continue saying what you're saying about how you believe MBTI and Enneagram work together.
Yeah.
And then we can go over to Tom. I just have a feeling that this is a fruitful way to go.
Yeah. So MBTI is really about cognition. It's not quite the same as the idea that there's different types of intelligence, but it's very much in that ballpark. It's more about how you use your brain rather than what your motivations are. So MBTI and Enneagram are not the same, but they can be very complementary. And you can see how if you are one Enneagram type, but a different Myers-Briggs type, that can be different. So I was saying that I'm an INFJ, but I'm also a type 1. Mm-hmm. And I have come across or typed real and fictional type 1s who are INTJ or ISTJ or whatever. Yeah. And I can totally see how I am the type 1s there. I can also see how I'm different to them because of the MBTI differences. For example,
right.
I'm obviously not as stone-faced as many type 1s like that. I'm much more, yeah, even though I'm a 1-wing-9 as well, because 1-wing-9s are usually the stone-faced ones. But it's also that type 1s are usually, if they're ISTJ or INTJ, they'll be more about the rules and the regulations, whereas I'm more about, say, feelings and social norms and that kind of thing. So I do care about the rules, but it's more in the sense of that because they are valued, so on. Also, as an intuitive, my sense of right and wrong is probably more abstract than for a sensing type, for example. So an ISTJ in particular will be very rule-focused. Mm-hmm. So this helps to explain the different types of type 1s and type 2s and so on. And I was also saying... Sorry. Go ahead. Okay.
In Enneagram terms, you might be talking about the wings.
I thought of that.
The stone-faced ones usually have a 9 wing.
Yes,
and you're talking about more of a 2-wing.
Yeah. See, that's what I was saying, though, because I consider myself a 1-wing-9, even though I'm not quite that stone-faced. So and I have typed someone else as a 1-wing-2 INFJ. So I was saying that the stone-faced ones, yes, they are 1-wing-9s, but they could also be ISTJs or INTJs because they're also stone-faced by nature, regardless of their Enneagram type all of the time. I was also saying how you're a type 6, and you were saying that when you were younger, your counterphobicness manifested as things like jumping in roofs and stuff. And my brother is also a type 6 in my opinion, but he is an INFP and his manifests a bit differently. He might be tempted to do that, but not quite as much because he's an INFP and they tend to be different from that. So
different expressions of behavior.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And
not so much about motivations, but about expressions.
Yeah, so it's more I'm trying to think of examples. Like when we used to, years ago, we climbed a mountain and he ran ahead and he got to the top, and on the way back down he was saying he didn't fear death anymore. He was proud of that little thing. But he's not, other than that and a few other things, he's not as much into physical activity as that. And I've seen other type 6s who are into horror movies and that thing.
Right.
So this is where MBTI can help Enneagram, because it can help flesh out the different, why type 6s can be so different from each other, why their counterphobicness and so on will manifest differently.
Yeah.
So that's basically what we're seeing.
So, Jonathan there mentioned cognition and the different kinds of intelligence. Here's Here's 7 kinds of intelligence plus a piece of advocacy at the bottom there for the green agenda.
Yeah, it's not quite the same as that, but it's similar. So
yeah. So for instance, we can say that linguistic usually like NFs are good linguistics and good linguistical intelligence. Because
my background's in NLP originally,
excellent.
and linguistic means auditory usually.
Right.
So does logical mathematical. And they call it auditory digital, meaning usually thinking in words or thinking in numbers or thinking in details, but saying them to yourself.
Interestingly enough, Victor Galenko believes that FI and TI DOMs are auditory based, but it's a little bit of a stretch. There's probably we won't get too much into the weeds in that, but there's a relationship there, but it might be a little bit like 60-40 rather than like 99% or something. And so,
auditory digital means the words or the lyrics, and then auditory musical is more what they call auditory tonal.
Right.
In other words, you're aware of tones, you're aware of how somebody's saying something. You might think in music, you might have the tunes, but not the lyrics.
Right. And here's an example. Where you got there interpersonal and intrapersonal. Where so Jonathan, if you using those two as an example, those two intelligences, if you talk about the differences between INFP and INFJ, that might flesh that out.
Yeah. Well, I was actually looking it up earlier, and intrapersonal is what INFPs do, but can also be what INTPs do, because it's very much about making decisions about yourself in general rather than feeling or thinking. How to explain that then? Right, so I think you read Russ Hudson's personality types, where they talk about Jung and how each Enneagram type correlates to a certain function. Tom?
Yeah, we teach together, Russ and I.
Ooh.
Right. Okay. Well, if you look at it from an MBTI perspective, there would actually be disagreement there, because what they would be saying, like they say that type 1s are Jung's extroverted thinking type, but in MBTI, the extroverted thinking type is the ENTJs and the ESTJs. So that would mean that all ENTJs are type 1s, which is not true, because most ENTJs actually type as 8s. And they say that the introverted intuitive types are 4s, and those are INFJs and INTJs in MBTI. Now, many INFJs are 4s, but obviously you're a 6, I'm a 1. Most INTJs are 5s or 6s or 1s again.
Well, they don't. The categories don't overlap very tightly, but there are preponderances.
Yeah. Well.
Yes.
Yes. Well.
Yeah.
What I would say is that the reason Jung's extroverted thinking type sounds like type 1s is because many ESTJs, which are the extroverted thinking types, are 1s, but not all. I think I'm just confusing you now.
Well, we're in the weeds with MBTI, and I'm not much with MBTI. What I do, the one distinction I see and apply in working with the Enneagram is introversion and extroversion, because it seems to me any Enneagram style can have either one.
It's because the thing is that MBTI goes way deeper than introversion, extroversion. That's just the.
I understand, but you understand.
That's the beginner stuff. Yes, I know.
I don't know much about it, and I'm deep into the Enneagram. If you have any questions about that, I can talk to it.
Okay.
Interpersonal and intrapersonal, for example, I would think about that in terms of subtypes. Social subtypes versus intimate subtypes, or one-to-one subtypes.
Yeah. Well, trying to get some questions. Why don't you talk about how you got into the Enneagram?
Well, I got involved with NLP first. It was about 1977, and NLP really hit me hard. Actually, in the early days, it was in its kind of pure form before it got sort of acquired a sleazy edge to it.
Yeah.
And the pure form of it I still really like, and it still exists with a number of people. There's a number of pretty good teachers around the world. And it took me about 2-3 years to hit the limits of NLP and kind of realized that I didn't really have a way to understand the whole person. And I lived in Berkeley, California at the time, and that turned out to be a hotbed of Enneagram teaching. There were Helen Palmer was teaching, and Claudio Naranjo, and a few others. I took a workshop with Helen, but I had a private practice in NLP, and my friends were therapists, and they were all involved with the Enneagram. And so they would bring me the notes from various courses that they took, the handouts, because there were no books in those days. And so I had my private practice for a number of years, and I just kind of sat with the notes and just kept reviewing them and kept trying to apply them and trying to figure out what kind of methods that I knew about would work best for different styles. And it seemed to me like the point of it was to grow and change and to use it to evolve and get out of your own way and go past old limitations. And then it also seemed to me like it was that there weren't very many methods. They would teach these courses to therapists, and the emphasis would be on the low side of Enneagram styles and how people were trapped and how they were screwed up and how they had blind spots and illusions and patterns of behavior that didn't work for them. And then their recommendations, generally speaking, were after you'd read all these things or learned all these negative things about yourself, the recommendations were, you really should meditate about that. That was one recommendation. Go ahead and meditate. And that was the main technique. And then the secondary technique was the recommendation was to stop it. If you're a 1 and you're judgmental, knock it off, quit it, stop it. And neither of those seemed quite sufficient. You know, it seemed like the Enneagram could use methods and techniques and anything that you threw at it, actually. So that's where I came in.
Right. So NLP is something I'm interested in. So I got this book, and have you read this book? And,
yeah.
What do you think of it?
Well, I think it's actually a good summary of NLP techniques. It's got a very large appendix,
right?
And that's a really good capture of a lot of NLP techniques. The integration of NLP and the Enneagram is not so successful, but I don't know. You know, you have to work with the Enneagram for a long time, I think, to integrate it and make it your own.
Yeah, that's why I'm sort of at the stage where I'm not yet at a point where I have a deep enough understanding where I can think clearly enough to be able to synthesize things. I get a little bit like that when, like, at certain points in Hangouts with Jonathan where things have been explained to me where I can make connections to other things. But I don't yet have the level of mastery where I'm able to develop things and make proper connections, because my understanding of it is too much. Many of the nuances are not quite there yet.
Well, it takes a while, and you have to live it for a while and kind of find your own examples of things, and then also there's quite a bit of difference between models that are about people and models that are about models.
Yeah, oh yes.
And they go back and forth in Enneagram circles with that, where people will create models and then the models are compounded and then they lead to other models, and you don't recognize people in it anymore, but it is elegant as a model.
Yeah, there was a really similar tendency in socionics where it can get overly deductive without getting into that. Whereas I think something like Kersey temperament theory is a little bit, I think, is quite good for diagnosing people, and also is something I think you would quite like, Tom, because it's, and Linda Berens renamed the Kersey temperaments essential motivator patterns. So it fits in quite well for Enneagram people. And just as Jonathan was saying there about abstract concrete. So for instance, if we were talking, we could talk a little bit about the 8 in that we were saying, Jonathan and I were having a discussion yesterday about the extroversion, introversion of 8s. And I think we both agree that the 8s pretty much have to be extroverted. And then there's also the different kinds of 8s.
No.
Yeah,
extroverted. Sorry. Yeah, but when we say extroverted, we mean in MBTI terms. So
yeah, you don't mean socially extroverted.
For example, you can have introverted ENTJs, introverted ESTPs, and so on. So it's a lot more complicated than it.
Yeah.
Obviously, they're very introverted 8s.
Yeah. It's about the direction of energy, how much focus you are on the external rather than in the internal, and so a lot of
8s are focused on the external, and then some aren't.
Yeah, but it's more complicated if you don't know the deeper MBTI stuff. Because if you knew the deeper MBTI stuff, you wouldn't necessarily agree with us anyway. But
well, there's another translation in Enneagram terms. At least for me, I use I notice wings, for example.
Yeah.
Yes.
8s with a 7 wing are often more extroverted than 8s with a 9 wing.
Yes.
And then there's the subtypes, whether somebody is sort of self-preservation in their focus and motivations and their preoccupations, or whether they make contact in one-to-one relationships in a really strong way, or whether they're social.
Yeah.
And that'll affect it too. And then 8 has a connection to 5, and 8 has a connection to 2. And the connection to 5, for example, if somebody's a really 5-ish 8, it'll bring a quality of introversion and needing, even in social 8s, they'll need to go and recharge themselves and kind of close themselves off and read books and things like that.
Yeah.
Because the rest of the time they're feeling responsible for the people in their world.
Mm-hmm.
As I said, we don't want to get too much into the Jungian stuff because you're an Enneagram person, and also because I like NLP as well. So a lot of the people on this channel don't know that much about NLP, and you, as someone who's like been in that world and come through the other side, you're not part of the NLP world. So it's not like you have an agenda of promoting it. You have an objective, unbiased view of NLP. So what do you think of, because usually when people will look at, say, NLP on Wikipedia, they'll look at the big claim of it. Oh, that's that system about I-accessing cues and primary representational systems. So what are your thoughts on how valid that is, the primary representational system?
Oh, I think it's pretty valid. And I think I-accessing cues are kind of obvious. Actually, there's something, I've seen research that disproves them, for example. But you can kind of prove it to yourself in 20 minutes. The NLP is a mixed bag, for one thing. There's 2 versions of it. One of them is kind of sleazy and glib and sociopathic. And the other one is kind of deep and extensive and very subtle and has lots of good methods for helping people change. And they really do work up to a point, and sometimes beyond that point. I found a need to integrate them with something like the Enneagram in order to give them material and give the techniques a deeper context. You can do, and one of NLP's techniques is curing people of phobias. And you can do that. It's pretty successful. And there are a lot of variations on it, but it's essentially, there's essentially a method for doing it that can often work pretty well and pretty fast. But it's much different if you cure a phobia in an 8 than if you cure a phobia in a 6. The phobia is held a different way. It has a different meaning. It is a stand-in for some deeper dynamic that's generated by their personality styles. For instance, you could take a phobia away from a 6, and they would then replace it with another phobia. If you take a phobia away from an 8, part of what it's helpful to understand is that you're dealing with the 8's sense of vulnerability, the kind of thing that they're organized against when they're trying to be strong and powerful. Things like that. I just find that it gives it a deeper context, and the context relates to themes that people have in their lives, and sometimes struggles, but also sometimes talents and abilities and capacities that are more generalized or more consistent through time. And, it's karma. And in working on that stuff, you can really go a long ways.
I think a good book for you, because Dario, another reason Dario is like a big NLP guy, is like this book, 8 Keys to Self-Leadership. And it's sort of like, done like the 8 Jungian functions as like in sort of NLP terms. So he'll call something like introverted feelings, staying true to yourself, and like give you exercises on how to stay true to yourself and work out what your values are, things like that. Things like TI. So basically, without getting into it, like, I think this is a good book for you because it's in NLP terms, and you can sort of like synthesize it and sort of take it on board in like an NLP way, rather than saying, oh, this is something to be a competing model with Enneagram. You can sort of like put your NLP hat on and say, hey, this is just a bunch of techniques to look at things.
So one of the things that is helpful in NLP is representational systems, that is to say sensory systems and sensory biases. And it takes sort of 2 forms from the standpoint of a practitioner. One is if somebody's got a problem, or they've got a skill, or they've got some behavior that they repeat habitually, there's a sequence of sensory steps that the person goes through. And they call it a strategy in NLP. And the sequence of sensory steps is kind of useful to know sometimes with something like the defensive low side expressions of an Enneagram styles. Usually there's a kind of pattern to it. There's a kind of sequence to it that you can start to pinpoint and get the person aware of. And often it's very helpful to them to begin to realize, oh, I'm sort of doing this even unconsciously. I'm kind of doing this to myself. And the other set of distinctions, or the other application of representational systems, is where they call them submodalities. It's like the senses within the senses.
Yes,
and
the aspects of them.
When you go into a familiar state, when you go into a familiar inner state, then there are describable and identifiable sensory qualities. Somebody who might be aware visually of color, or they might be aware of size or something like that. And then there's internal dialogue, the way the person talks to themselves consistently in that internal state. And then body feelings and emotional feelings that go with it, maybe even a taste or a smell. And in exploring that with Enneagram styles, what I find is that when people go into the low side of their Enneagram style, there's a kind of consistency to it. There's a kind of way in which they are, especially when they're having problems or they're trying to overcome something. I'll take 6s for an example. A 6 who is scaring themselves, which is what 6s do. They scare themselves usually with big pictures, not with small pictures. Usually the pictures are movies. They're not, still frozen pictures like a painting. A lot of times the fearful thing is sort of panoramic, but also it's larger than they are. It's a projection screen, but they're projecting onto a large screen. And so they feel small and kind of helpless and weak in relation to this large, powerful thing. And then maybe they have a soundtrack that goes with the movie, where they're talking to themselves in a really sped up, urgent sort of way. And then they have anxiety. And the anxiety will be in their upper chest, and maybe down in their belly, there'll be kind of a feeling of like a steel band or a kind of numbness. That's not true of every 6 every time when they scare themselves, but those factors come into play a lot, and they can be modified and worked with, and it kind of helps the person start to realize that they're creating their own trance, so to speak, in a kind of inner mental theater of the absurd.
I think that right, because I've got a friend and someone frequently on this channel, Hannah. She's an Enneagram type 6, and she asked Catherine Farber for advice, and it seems it's hard to give advice to the 6. So I think, like, because you know about NLP, and Catherine does as well, but it's just like, I mean, instead of asking about my own type, might be type 5, might be type 4, but asking about what. So from the world of NLP, what advice do you think Enneagram type 6s can use? What is useful for that type? What can help them?
They could look up phobia techniques, for one thing, from NLP.
Right.
That begins to give you an idea of what the sensory structure of what you're doing a lot of the time when you're scaring yourself is. There's different things. It depends on how uncomfortable the person is and how much they are motivated to grow and change. A lot of times 6s are motivated by avoiding a worse alternative. You know, somebody goes to a therapist and they say, well, I've got this terrible anxiety, but my wife says if I don't do something about my anxiety, she's going to leave me. You know, so there's a kind of worse alternative. They're motivated away from a negative. And that varies from individual to individual, where they are in their life and how much they know about their own pattern and maybe how sick of it they are. But let's assume there's some motivation involved. Then the next thing would be to be as honest as possible about projections and to begin to identify and maybe even do some writing or, write down incidents and times when you were really clear you were projecting. And then what was it you were projecting? What power? Because that's what 6s do. They'll project power. They'll take their own power out of their body and out of themselves and kind of paint it on the face of something larger and darker and angrier than they are, and then react to the power. And in doing that, then they're displacing their own power. They're, the thing they're projecting onto is a stand-in for their own power. So beginning to be willing to take back power, even if it's scary, and kind of breathe it back in and identify with it and get inside of it, that becomes helpful too. There are other things with 6s, like they can be superstitious. They can believe in fate and believe in, good luck and bad luck. So sometimes with 6s, I've recommended they get a lucky charm and carry it around. They used to do rabbit foots in the old days, but that's kind of cruel.
Yeah, I don't think Hannah would go for that.
Yeah.
See,
no, it wouldn't be popular.
No. Well, Hannah wouldn't go for it because Hannah's very atheist and not into superstition at all. So she's one of the opposite 6s, where it's like.
Although she has studied religion in depth, Hannah. Yeah. Philosophically.
Well, it depends on the person, like I say.
Yeah. This is like. No, you first. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
All right. This was the thing we were chatting about, because you were saying that I read in one of your books that you went to a meeting where everyone was a 1, they were all deriding superstition and religion and so on. And I was saying that whenever I've come across that kind of thing, I tend to think they're 6s. And more specifically, usually it's people I have already typed as 6s for different reasons. And there is a certain way they talk about it, though, where it's like they're treating superstition as a threat, as a menace to society, that, they're more worried about things like people being taken advantage of by this sort of thing. So it's
well, the difference in 6s versus 1s is that the 6 will project power, and then when you hear them talking, what they're talking about is what the power out there, the injustice out there, or the force out there can do to them. Whereas with a 1, they're not exactly projecting because they don't have a doubt that they still have their own power. They don't have a doubt about their own capacities so much as they have a worry about doing things right, because otherwise they'll call down a cosmic shitstorm on themselves. They'll call down criticism, or they'll call down condemnation, or they'll make a mistake and feel bad for a very long time. But the scientific mindset, it can go with either styles. I've seen it with ones who were, kind of adamant about the facts, and 3s can be that way as well. Sometimes they're very, oriented to the material world. Some 8s are like that, and sometimes 6s. Yeah,
I definitely noticed the nuances between different people when they're talking about this thing.
And motivations.
Yeah.
Jonathan, what is Hannah's tri-type?
I don't think Tom's really about tri-type, but it's
okay.
6. Yeah, it's more Catherine Fowler's thing.
Okay.
He's 6, 1, 4, so a 6 with a strong connection to 1 and 4, basically.
Right.
And actually, quite a lot of the 6s I said, I was talking about, they do have a connection to 1, so either way.
Well, with 6, the tendency is to carry your parents around a lot more than other styles.
Oh yeah, I've noticed that.
So if the 6 has a 1 parent, for example, they'll sound like a 1, and they'll have a connection to 1. And certain kinds of a kind of thoroughness, a kind of procedural approach to things, and a lot of times, and they can be moralistic.
That is very interesting to me, Tom, because Hannah's mother is an MBTI type called an ISFP, and Hannah, who I believe is an INFP, sometimes believes that she is an ISFP, and that might be, and she very much liked her mother as well, and that might be the influence of her mother.
Yeah, there can be a positive identification or a negative identification, either one, but the 6 will carry the person.
Yeah.
Right. So you've looked at. So when they do those studies, so when you're looking at primary representational system, Tom, and is it a case? How reliable is it, do you believe, for a particular person? Right, as a generalization, or is it more about using it to get a baseline on someone and then noticing, so in order to tell when they're lying or going into different modes, is it better to use it specifically on someone?
I don't use it that way. I did read somewhere that there was research that disproved the idea that when people's eyes look up and to the right, they're lying. And that was a claim of NLP. I have to tell you, I was involved with NLP in the early days, and nobody ever claimed that. That's somebody else who made it up at a certain point, and then the research went and proved him wrong. But that stuff's kind of, you can't use it that way, I don't think. At least I don't.
I think NLP has caused itself a problem by the fact that it's their own fault for like having these courses where you pay to get the course and automatically you qualify.
Right.
And there's no kind of quality control.
Right.
To like find out who's good and who's not, who's been through a course, who's good. Because someone could just turn up, there's no way to know who's good because there's no examine it.
There's a story about a man who's found the truth being followed by the devil. And
yes.
Someone sees this, goes up to the devil and says, "Why are you following a man who's found the truth?" And the devil says, "Well, he may have found the truth, but I'm going to help him organize it."
Yeah.
And NLP really changed when they started with certification programs. And some of the first ones were conscientious, but then they got real diluted and corrupt and creepy.
Yeah,
So you can have a middle-aged bridge engineer who has a midlife crisis and who takes an NLP practitioner course, and suddenly he's an NLP practitioner, and he doesn't really have a firm idea about the difference between bridges and people.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Because that is and I recently heard a phrase that I think is so spot on for certain NLP people, and what it can turn them into: social robots.
I call them outcome monsters. The same idea, though.
Yeah. It's like and you can have there's a certain MBTI type called the INTJ, and they can use NLP and as a self development tool. And a good person to notice that somebody who uses it quite well, in my opinion, is Dario Nardi, because he's an INTJ and he's big into NLP, but he is also the kind of INTJ that sort of developed a lot in terms of INFP type activity. So somebody who's really worked on, someone who appears to continually work on their intrapersonal intelligence, their beliefs and values and things like that. And
he presented at an Enneagram conference a few years ago.
Yeah, he does tend to keep quiet about how much he knows about Enneagram. You have to sort of wheedle it out of him. He does keep quiet about how much he knows, because he does know a lot.
Yeah, I think so.
Oh yes. So you've probably read this book more than once. So what do you think of this book? Oh, that is right camera. Turtles All the Way Down by John Grinder.
I didn't read it. That came out later after I stopped reading both NLP books and Enneagram books.
Yeah.
Right. What I've heard, this is what I've heard about NLP, and I don't, and because you're outside of the world of it, you might be able to comment on this. I have heard that John Grinder is okay, but Richard Bandler maybe a little bit tricky. Any comments on that? About who's a trust and who not?
No, that's a character reference thing. I think you have to take these things with a grain of salt. Don't put people on a pedestal.
Yep.
Give them sample the material. You could find material on YouTube from both Bandler and Grinder, and see what you thought and get a feeling for the people. That's too much like gossip, that one.
Right. Very diplomatic. Right. But what I've noticed from watching Grinder is that he does have he tries to give it more of an emphasis on sort of using the techniques ethically, and also, ironically enough, like trying to teach people the techniques, but then trying to get people to like forget them, so it becomes secondary nature, so they don't become that social robot thing. And there's consensus between some people I know that John Grinder is a very good example of MBTI ISTP. And
I wouldn't know that.
But what I can say about that is, do you know? You've probably heard it. You've probably been taught the meta model. Is that right, Tom?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So this is how they look at language, and one of the parts of the meta model, folks, is something called complex equivalence, where someone says that A equals B, and B has nothing to do with A, and that is a thing of the ISTP, where the ISTP is something in sociology called NE break, which means extroverted intuition break, which basically means that the ISTP is very much like, no, it's not like this. If you're saying that A is like B, then you're being reductionist, you're warping things, you're misrepresenting things. Whereas someone like INTP, we're much more likely to say A is like B. like find the connections between things. Use trans-contextual thinking, whereas John Grinder is all about like separate things out, have a know-nothing state, where I think he sees that stuff that you already know is a filter to learning new things, because there is a tendency to only accept that information which goes with what you already know, and so you don't accept the new information. I can understand that, and you can see that especially in certain like SJ types where people get set in their ways and they don't want to accept anything new. But as an INTP, as an NP, someone with NP in my MBTI code, I like making connections with what I already know. So like, because then you get things from like lots of different angles, and so it's like build up, and so a multiple models approach of learning about things. So yeah, I mean, so John Grinder, so that's a little, so it is useful NLP, but people need to.
That would kind of fit if John Grinder was a 7.
Might be. He might be, but because there was one thing that there's one thing that Bandler said about Grinder, was that he said that he thought he was a little bit crazy for it's just him being ISTP, about rock climbing. And he goes, no, that's just him being an SP. They like it's so so we'll get back on track. So is there anything else to talk about in the NLP before we move on? Because some of the we talked about the eye accessing cues.
There's a lot of good methods in NLP.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And they're depending on how you use them and with what kind of expertise. What Grinder might be talking about in the situations you're quoting are when you get good at something and you practice and you make it unconscious, because we're consciously preoccupied with things we don't know how to do very well. And then once we know how to do them, they become part of our system of reflexes.
Right. What I could do is I'll just quickly go through the 5 steps to modeling a genius, and this pretty much outlines his process, and it actually shows. So and it shows how you can. I've come to the opinion that you can model a genius if it's a particular kind of genius, and if you're John Grinder, who's already good at linguistics, that it fits in there are certain things which can be modeled and certain things which can't be modeled. But I'll go through this sequence. So what he did, so as we know, John Grinder was a linguist teaching at university, and he found a genius, and to him the genius was Milton H. Erickson, world famous hypnotherapist. And so that was like step 1. Step 2 is you get into, and then there's something about a know-nothing state, so one can unconsciously assimilate. So what he then did was he went through as much information as possible on Milton H. Erickson, all of his, like, all the things he would say to like hypnotize people, help them, just absorb it all over a 6-month process. Then the 3rd step was to be able to get to a point where then he could imitate, where he could be a hypnotist himself, use these techniques, where he then got as good. And then step 4 was, right, okay, now I'm good at it. Now I'm going to break down using his own linguistic abilities to break down what he was doing with language, because Erickson's method was, and so he broke down Erickson's method according to the language patterns. Right, and then once he had codified this, then he produced this code from the codification, and the test was, okay, if I then give this code, so they did the book like the patterns and hypnotic techniques of Milton H. Erickson, give it to somebody else, and then if they are then able to like get good results using these techniques, then they have modeled the genius correctly. So I think in that instance, the modeling worked. However, you'll get these things where certain people who are like on the NLP gravy train think that they can teach people to model anything and everything.
Right.
And it's not that.
And become play chess like Kasparov.
Yeah, stuff like that.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's called grandiosity in other people's models.
But I mean, just stuff like, I mean, this book, Mastery, by Robert Greene, it's just a similar thing. It's the idea of learning techniques, learning, finding a mentor, the ultimately learning. So, for instance, when people, or I believe that writing should be treated like any other art form on a huge. So, for instance, people want to learn how to be a proper artist. Well, right, if they go through all of the techniques, especially musician, all of the techniques, all of the training, all of that, where you get to a point where all the techniques, all the technical stuff becomes secondary nature, where you don't focus on that, that unconscious competence, where then you're not being robotic about it. And a lot of people in NLP, they're using it robotically. For a lot of guys are using it, or they're using it in like sales, or they're using it in pickup, but they're using it so robotically, it just comes across as creepy.
They forgot to model the morality of it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's creepy, and it's also a lot of times it's not as good as they think it is too.
Oh yes, definitely.
It's there's Dunning-Kruger, you know what that is, where there's people think they're more competent than they really are. There's some of that in there too, I'd say. I use modeling in a kind of loose, informal way with the Enneagram. In two ways. One way is to have people model their own style, the high side of their own style. What's it like when they're at their best? Maybe they come up with examples of healthy versions of their style, and to use that as a model, and to develop kind of sensory rich representations and fantasies about it, and then step inside of those. That's one thing. And the other thing is, when people learn the Enneagram, they start to realize that they'll say things like, well, there's certain Enneagram styles I really admire and really like, and other ones I don't like. And what they start to realize is that the Enneagram showing them their shadows. And there are light shadows and there are dark shadows, meaning there are shadows of capabilities and talents and capacities that a person might want to model and admires and maybe looks up to, but they don't believe that they have it in themselves. But actually the fact that they keep noticing it indicates it is in them somewhere, the potential for it anyway. And then also negative shadows usually indicate parts of yourself that you're sort of pushing away and have disowned and are projecting or relocating or reacting to in other people. Certain kinds of people you don't like, where you get a kind of instant reflexive reaction to it, to their behavior. And using modeling for either of these is really helpful.
What I've noticed about what I was thinking there when you started your answer was thinking about this. There are a lot of people in the MBTI community, socionics community, Enneagram community. There is a real search for identity. And what you're saying about a model, and they see these types as their role model. They super identify with these types. And there are people who get upset when they don't fit a particular type. They really want to know their type. And it's like they are looking towards these models as a role model, as a guidance, as what to do, as sort of a handbook on life for their type.
Well, there's other versions of the Enneagram that say, well, that is your personality type, but it's not really you. And those models will separate them too completely. They'll say there's your personality and then there's your essence, and they have nothing to do with each other, which seems sort of ridiculous and impractical. But at the same time, there is a way in which as you work on these things and work on your own patterns and your own inheritance and your own reactions and reactivity, that you get more and more free. You get more and more open, and then you a broader sense of yourself, and you're not craving identity in the same way. Some of it has to do with age too. You know, when you're really young, the preoccupation with identity is pretty strong. You've got to kind of know who you are in order to then begin to forget who you thought you were. You know.
Right. I don't think there's anything before we end this section on NLP. I don't think there's anything. Oh, let Jonathan get in here. Have you heard anything you'd like to?
Well, no, I've actually had to say that I've been reading Tom's book on movies. Yeah, I don't want to get into that because I'm actually a film critic, or part-time film critic. And I've been kind of, I mean, even before I got into typology, I've been kind of doing that because I've been into psychology in a general sense for a long time. So I've always been thinking about the psychology of different characters and how they meet that. So I have, one of the very first things I did after I got into MBTI and the Enneagram was start typing fictional characters in films and stories. So it's just interesting to get a different point of view in that, seeing how you see characters. One thing I noticed was you said that the nurse from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is a type 1. And that's just, I just find that straight.
Sorry.
Yeah, I know. Yes. It's because when I saw that film,
it's always good news and bad news. You know,
bad. I know. When I saw that film, it took me years and years to see. I only saw it recently, and I couldn't finish it because of her scenes. They were. I can usually sit through all sorts of things, but her scenes were like.
She was great.
Yeah, she was great, but she was creepiest. She seemed. I could understand everything she was doing, and it was horrible. But she was just so incredibly sadistic in a way that just unnerved me in the way that even the sadism of other characters wouldn't. Yeah, so that's...
And I think I said in the book that 1s and 7s are paired off in movies a lot. And that was an example right there.
Yeah, totally. I don't know what to say.
But let me say, she was really unhealthy. And
clearly.
Nelson Mandela would not have handled the situation the same way, or somebody else who was a fairly healthy one, you know, principled and upright and out of their own way. Yeah, she was a villain.
Yeah, I was actually constructing a backstory for her in my head, where it's like she's just really unhappy with the fact that she's got this job and she has to deal with these patients, these people who she just doesn't like, and so she's basically taking her envy and resentment out on them and finding ways to humiliate them. And it was just so it unnerved me in ways that even other type 1 villains haven't, funnily enough. But yeah, but that was a very
there's a shadow.
I suppose in a way that was a very realistic type 1 villain as far as other ones go. So
we've done a video on the Enneagram types of the Batman characters. So just by chance, Tom, are you a big Batman fan? Like
I wouldn't say no, not big.
Yeah,
not big. So maybe he's got a collection.
See,
the main character moves back and forth between 5 and 8. It seems like.
Yeah, I would actually say that the recent movies, especially the very recent one with Ben Affleck, he's a 6. You can see the fear in his eyes. I think that's because Ben Affleck.
Yeah, I didn't see that.
Yeah, don't.
Ben Affleck's probably a 6 himself. Huh?
Definitely. Yeah. Christian Bale, I think, is a 6, but I don't know if he plays his Batman as a 6 or a 5. It's hard to say. But
Michael Keaton's a 7.
Yeah, he plays as a bit more 5-ish.
I could see it there, the back and forth between 7 and 5 or 8 and 5.
Yeah, but I would say the main character in the actual source material and the main version is definitely an 8. If you see
Is he?
Yeah, because if you see, like, there's a game called the Arkham Games, which is about Batman, and if you see something like the Ben Affleck version and the that version, is night and day. It's like he's way more assertive and intimidating and fearless and so on. Yeah, that's the thing. had trouble figuring out the Joker though, because the Joker seems very 7-ish, but he could be like an 8 or a 3 even. He's very he's way more psychopathic than most, even the worst, most unhealthy 7. He seems extreme for that, but he just seems very 7-ish at times.
I think he's played by 7s a lot, like Jack Nicholson and Heath Ledger. Yeah.
There are probably a lot of people who identify with Enneagram 5, Enneagram 4 watching this video. And when I look at Rita and Hudson's description, I think I'm a 4. When I look at Beatrice Chestnut's description of like Enneagram 5 sexual, I feel maybe it might be a little bit. So I'm caught in between the two. And so,
which one would you rather not be?
I don't know. I mean, and also I've heard about how Naranjo came to write this sexual 4 profile, so maybe it's not completely accurate. So
what do you mean by that?
Well, the way they write the sexual 4 is, a crazy person.
Yeah, because apparently it was based on someone he knew in real life.
Oh, okay.
So it might not necessarily be
a large sample.
Yeah, a fair representation of the type. So given that, as Jonathan said,
I haven't read her book, so I don't know.
Right.
It's a very good book. It's a very good book. You should.
People like it. Yeah, I have my own version of those things, which sounds different from what I've heard.
Okay, if you tell us what's your version of that?
Of a 5 versus a sexual 4?
Yeah.
Or sexual 5 versus sexual 4, because pretty sure he's sexual first.
Yeah, Jonathan thinks it's so obvious with me.
Well, sexual 4s usually on the high side. There's a romanticism that's kind of overt and unapologetic, and it's sort of like the troubadour tradition or something like that, or the realm of confessional singer poets, where they write about love, or they'll write about the inner life and kind of sort of be able to describe the unconscious consciously, that sort of thing. There can be a way in which you're you get together in a relationship and maybe it breaks up, but you never quite get over it. And you kind of hold a candle for the person and you kind of romanticize your past history. On the low side, you might get into a relationship and you're sort of envious and you're kind of rivalrous, and there's a drive and a kind of anger, a kind of resentment in it. And in the envy, there's also a kind of competitiveness, like you want to be the number one in somebody's life. You want to be the only person they've ever loved, and if there's anybody like that in the background, then you're mad at them, or you vilify them somehow in your mind. And there could be a sort of persecutory anger in it, when a drive. And that's pretty different from a sexual 5, where, in my version of it, where there's on the high side, a kind of capacity for making connections with people that is really specific and multi-leveled, and you're able to kind of connect with somebody in a way that is where you're not comparing them to anybody else, and you're in a sort of bubble together, and you could be out around the rings of Saturn for all you know, but you're really connected and concentrated. There can be an open or closed quality to sexual 5, where some of the time you're completely wide open, and then other times you're closed and you sit there kind of quiet like a Buddha. And then somebody gets you talking and you don't stop talking, that kind of thing, where you go back and forth. And there, sometimes there can be an emotional quality to it. There's some sexual 5s are extroverted. It's usually, when there's extroverted 5s, it's usually social, but there's a few sexual 5s I find are more extroverted than introverted. And you can get obsessed about somebody, and kind of be fascinated with them from a distance, but they're not close by, but you have a long distance relationship. You could have long distance relationships that were actually comfortable to you, that had built-in distances to them, or sometimes a dissociated quality where you're interested in somebody and you're focused on somebody and kind of pursuing them, but they don't want you, something like that.
Okay, well, I would say that your descriptions are actually quite close to Chestnut's descriptions.
Good.
And and I would say that that's Ben's is a lot more like a sexual 5 there than a 4. Sexual 4.
Yeah, I even clicked on Jonathan's box there where I was having a little chuckle to myself.
Well, with 5, the general tendency is towards intellectual intelligence or detailed kind of cognitive intelligence. And with 4, the general tendency is towards emotional intelligence. It's driven by feeling.
Yeah.
And the feelings come first.
Yeah. It's mostly because he's a 5-wing 4.
That's confusing.
Either way.
It's confusing.
Or a 4-wing 5, but
yeah. Russ Hudson's a 5 with a 4-wing.
Yeah. I think Russ Hudson's an INTJ. I've seen him in interviews just as a throwaway comment.
Yeah, I don't know.
Tom, what is your opinion on the stacking in terms of the relationship between the first and the second? Are you slightly different from Catherine in that regard? How do you see the stacking system?
What does Catherine say?
Yeah, she says that you've got all 3 instincts just in a certain order. So your first instinct is your neurotic fixation. And more or less, your second is the one you're more comfortable with, and the third is it can be your blind spot, or it can also be your hidden agenda, depending on how you use it. But
she also said that the second one can be a source of arrogance.
Arrogance?
Pride.
Right.
That's what she said.
I don't know about that. The stacking part of it, I agree with generally, in the sense that people will characterologically be preoccupied with certain aspects of their lives that relate to self-pres or relationships, intimate relationships, or groups and their place in a group and their relationship to a group. I think with the subtypes, you can go through them. You can cycle through them all in one day. You can go through them at different phases in your life. If you're starting a business or you're going bankrupt, you might be in a self-pres mode. If you're falling in love, getting married, or getting divorced, you might be in an intimate subtype mode. You go to work at a big company and suddenly you're in a social mode, something like that. And then there's usually 1 and maybe 2 that are characterologically prominent that you default to, that you return to, and sometimes they combine in a way, and sometimes 1 is really obviously more prominent. Sometimes if you're really strong in 1, then the others are kind of pulled through it. The motivations that go with self-preservation, for example. If somebody grows up in a small village and they're basically self-preservation in their orientation, they might still be also social in order to stay on good terms with everyone in case you need them in an emergency, which would be self-pres. Yeah, so the motivation is self-preservation, but the social part is sort of pulled through that motivation. And I don't know about how to classify them in terms of 1 brings arrogance or 1 is.
Well, I think you say that for some people can be arrogant about it rather than all people necessarily. It's more like I don't know about that. He talks about more like the strength of them and that kind of thing.
I find people get caught in loops with them, and that they're sometimes when they work on their preoccupation, that it's quite helpful and they get free, and then they have access to the high side, because I think each one of the subtypes brings talents and resources and capacities.
I don't think you necessarily disagree with her. I think it's more just coming at it from a different angle.
No doubt. Yeah.
I've heard two different opinions on the instinct of Donald Trump. What instinct do you think he is, Tom, in your opinion?
Well, the narcissism part of it, which is, and the three-ishness of him, which is, I don't think that's his dominant style, but it goes with a 7 wing. And so does the sexual subtype.
Right.
You think he's sexual?
He's not social, and he's barely self-preservation. I don't think he's actually. The whole thing is about thin skin.
Oh yeah.
About image and ego and self and reactionary responses. Yeah. He's crazy.
He can be rattled, but
he's crazy. And we elected him.
Yeah, I don't think he's that narcissistic based on what he's done. I mean, I might argue that Obama's a little bit more narcissistic, but that's a separate hangout.
Well, just bear in mind, Trump is only 12 years old. And that's actually unusual for age. They're usually age progress. They're not usually age regress.
Well, this is the thing.
I'm going to end this right now and move on.
I'll just say something that ESTPs and Trump is an ESTP. Most people think is an ESTP. Is that ESTPs? It's like they will surprise you and disappoint you a lot. Do amazingly stupid things and very smart things, and they are like that. They are weird in that area.
And you're hoping for smart things.
Yeah, sometimes they do very smart things.
We're bracing for stupid things over here.
Yeah.
Well, more like he'll do smart things and stupid things. That's pretty much.
Yeah, they do both because ESTPs, they're
short-sighted and impulsive, but they're good at thinking in the moment.
Yes, in the moment they can be very.
Yeah.
So, for instance, here's an example of an ESTP, JFK. He got it absolutely right in the Cuban Missile Crisis because the Soviet troops in Cuba had orders that if they were attacked, they were to launch the missiles.
Well, he was a bulwark against the Joint Chiefs of Staffs that we had here, and they were crazy. They wanted to nuke Cuba.
Yeah, but anyway, moving on from the politics because that's going for the bush.
Yeah.
Yep.
I was going to say, I was having arguments about, since I've got an Enneagram expert here, I was having arguments about the type of certain people. Like recently, I was talking about Star Wars with some people on the internet, and
I'm only halfway through Rogue One. I've seen that. I've seen that one that came out last year. I'll let you get back in a minute. I'm just saying I've seen that. What's that rubbish one that came out recently? What's it called?
Force Awakens. The
Force Awakens. Yeah, I didn't like that. I like. I'm halfway through Rogue One. I like the tone of Rogue One a lot more. But I'm just so I don't want you dropping any spoilers there.
I'm not.
I've not seen it.
But
I saw the other one.
Yeah, I'm talking about classic Star Wars here.
Oh, proper Star Wars. Okay.
Yeah, I was asked. It was about the type of the Emperor, the villain. Darth Vader's boss. So because normally I've seen him typed as an 8 and stuff, and something Catherine Favre said in the previous hangout about a different person made me think that he was actually a social 2, and this started a big argument because people were saying that no, he's not. And so they were saying that he's an 8.
When people are arguing about this, are they sure that they have enough information to make an informed judgment?
Well, I'm a big Star Wars geek, so I know, me personally, I know I've got a lot of information, like not just from I've seen all the films, so even the prequels, there's a lot more in the prequels. He's a lot more 2-ish in the prequels. Where he's...
Are you talking Darth Vader?
No, his boss, the Emperor.
Palpatine.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Because he's very...
He's written well. He's written quite well in the prequels. He's probably the best written character in the prequels.
Yeah, he's very... In the prequels, it's about his rise to power, and he's very charming, and he's always pretending to be everyone's friend and confidant and mentor and so on, while secretly he's plotting their downfall all the time. And I was saying that sounds quite social too-ish.
Ish, I think, is the key thing.
Yeah.
When I was writing that video guide, it seemed to me like there were films that would kind of allude to Enneagram styles, but they weren't really thoroughly there.
Yeah.
They weren't in the character's motivation or obvious behavior or way they talked and way they acted. But, sometimes it was 2-ish or 8-ish, but it wasn't really a 2 or an 8.
Yeah.
So we need to remember, though, that as fictional characters, and I've been in this position where you will have characters do things that not necessarily out of the essence of them is it's sort of like it's done for a plot reason, and then the writer might go back and then fuddle something to try and make the motivation work. And so this is why they can sort of like go out of their range. Whereas I think maybe if someone looked at, say, characters in novels, because a lot of novelists are more focused on the internal life, they may be more consistent, especially versus something in movies, I should think, because you have got the inner monologue, and novelists are going to be much more focused on the motivation.
Ingmar Bergman movies are pretty good for Enneagram types. So are Woody Allen movies. So are movies based on Jane Austen novels.
Yeah, well, I would say that for this character, because he's a very two-faced character, he's pretending to be something he isn't for much of the film, and you don't really see that much of his backstory in the films. It's a bit harder. When I consider that and all the other things like the novels based in the films, I could see that more It does go a bit more into psychology, like when in one book it's about his childhood, well, as a young man, and he's at odds with his father, who's a very controlling, domineering character. And again, he's always very polite and considerate in public, but secretly he's doing things like plotting to sabotage his father's career and so on. He's clearly, it's clearly he really hates his father, but he's also is the kind of fate where, like, you care about this guy so much that you hate him. You're trying to ruin his life to get his attention. So that also, I think, sounds more two-ish as well. But I'm just throwing thoughts out there.
Which type, Tom, do you think James Bond is?
Depends on the version.
It depends on the version.
Yeah.
It's more to do with the actors, it seems like.
Yeah.
Like Sean Connery was kind of 8-ish, and he's obviously an 8 in real life. And Roger Moore was kind of 3-ish, and seems like a 3.
Jonathan,
Daniel Craig, I think, is a counterphobic 6, but he seemed to play James Bond as kind of a 3, kind of a sociopathic 3.
Jonathan, is Sean Connery an 8, or is it just the part of Scotland he grew up in?
No, he's either. I'd say he's either an 8 or a 9 wing 8, possibly. But
yeah,
I could definitely.
I read a bunch of books about him. Did a lot of research. It was it never varied, actually.
Yeah, I would say I haven't seen enough about it to make that opinion, but plus, I don't know what that part of Scotland you would mean is, because I come off as apparently like an INTJ when I'm not.
It's like, so for instance, you can have types, Tom, say that are very much like thinking types, but if they are, say, in a certain part of France or Italy, they might be more emotional and come off more feeling than, say, thinking types in other cultures. I've
seen emotional 5s who were Italian, for example. One of the things I noticed in France was that a lot of the actors who weren't 4s or even connected to 4s could still play 4s in movies.
Yeah.
And it was sort of like a national Enneagram style or a cultural Enneagram style. Things like that.
I almost think that the Russian Enneagram type is counterphobic 6. I just tend to think the Russian Enneagram style is counterphobic 6, the combination of paranoia and aggression.
The version?
Russian.
Sorry.
I don't know what you think of that.
I don't know.
What do you think, Jonathan?
I think it's overgeneralized.
Yeah, I know, but I know that's what I think as well. When sometimes Victor talks about the United States having a national character type of ENTJ, and I think I wish that would be the ideal.
What do you think? Vladimir Putin's Enneagram type is, Tom?
I think he's a counterphobic 6.
And
I think he's somewhat has some degree of Asperger's.
Well, that's because in MBTI he's an ISTP, so they'll often seem like they have Asperger's, but I don't think he does 60% traits.
Tom, do you think you can really see it in Putin's eyes?
No, you don't look in people's eyes and then pronounce on their Enneagram styles. You read a bunch of books.
Well, no. What I mean is, but what I notice in his eyes, I see quite a bit of fear.
Yeah. So that would not be a defining characteristic. That would be a clue.
Yeah, a clue. Yeah.
I would. See,
you amass a lot of clues, and then you know.
Yeah, but you see, the thing is, the two things I should have mentioned. What I should have said is, I'm pretty sure it's an ISTP, and so when I see, okay, this is an ISTP, but then when I see what is in his eyes, then that makes me think, oh, he's probably a counterphobic. It's those two pieces of information, rather than just looking in his eyes. I'm looking at these two conflicting traits of somebody being aggressive, but yet seeing this worry in their eyes.
Well, why stop there?
Well, there are other things, but I'm just not mentioning them all.
All right.
Tom, Ben just likes looking at people's eyes. So.
Distinguishing between what's a clue and what's an indicator versus what's a conclusion is sort of what I'm hassling you about. And it's nothing personal. Everybody does it, but there is a distinction.
It's all part of the jigsaw.
It's a jigsaw. That's right. Yeah.
See, I've actually read some stuff about him. He actually sounded almost 9-ish at times, like a self-present 9.
Got a 5 wing, that one too.
It's something I need to read more into, because I think a lot hard. I don't know, for something I'm just a little bit wary in the 6, but that's whatever. I'm not sold in the 6, but that's another thing entirely. Right.
Yeah, but that's what I mean. That might just be the natural sort of Russian character of leaders, where just because of their geography, they are worried about, because they have borders with so many countries, they're worried about, they're in a sort of defensive, sometimes aggressive posture.
Russia usually has 8 leaders who are 8s. Gorbachev, Yeltsin, Brezhnev, Khrushchev, Stalin. Yeah. There's a bunch of them.
Would you say that Lenin was a 1, perhaps?
I don't know. I don't know enough about him. I think I read some stuff about him at one point where he was pretty 5-ish also, but I don't know.
Yeah, well, he's not very dominating and aggressive and angry like a...
No.
Well, but he was also things like he had contempt for statues and stuff. He was more concerned about a really brutal version of fairness. So, but
depends on what motivates it.
Yeah.
What made Stalin 8 rather than counterphobic 6?
Research.
Such as?
Books and books and books.
Yeah. Do you agree with that, Jonathan?
I do agree that he's an 8, yes. Especially compared to Hitler, for example. Hitler is much more ambivalent and indecisive and overly reactionary and so on. And you could definitely see Hitler projecting a lot more, projecting the big conspiracies. But Stalin definitely was paranoid, but he was more of an
that's
in control.
what I was trying to get at.
He was more of an in control sort of paranoia.
So, what do you think the paranoia is like an extra type factor, outside
There's
of the type?
There's a connection from 8 to 5.
Yeah, well,
brings paranoia.
It's more like type 6 and type 8 can both be paranoid, but in different ways. It's like the paranoia of the wolf versus the paranoia of the sheep, shall we say, to put it rudely.
Yeah, the paranoia is about different things. It has a different subject.
Yeah,
right.
So yeah. But yeah, I think that's... Can't think of anything.
Dungeon. So, Jonathan, did you canvass some questions for Tom?
I did not. I'm sorry. Well, when I was doing with when I was doing Catherine Favre, I got a whole bunch of questions for her together from a bunch of people, but it was about.
Are there any of those that you would also like to ask Tom? Any of those questions?
Well, a lot of them were about her tri-type stuff, so
right, okay.
Try and see. The other thing was about different methods for typing people.
Oh, one thing I could ask about, Tom, because it's not something I know that much about, is how true is the centers aspect, in your opinion?
To me, it's a metaphor, and there are different types of intelligence. There's instinctual intelligence and emotional intelligence and mental intelligence. In NLP terms, they break down differently. Usually mental intelligence is kind of visual and auditory. Heart intelligence, emotional intelligence is related to emotional kinesthetics. Instinctual intelligence is related to proprioceptive kinesthetics, to body kinesthetics. And people have various things that they say about the centers. It is obvious to me when a person is preoccupied and largely inhabiting one center, and maybe it's good for them to expand to the others, and maybe that is if not a goal of change work, a result of change work. But I don't have real elaborate theories about them otherwise.
Right, so when you said there, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. You say how do you pronounce it?
Proprioceptive, just the kinesthetics, feelings that are of the body. Right. your gut instincts, and instead of having an emotional reaction, you say, "Oh, that makes my skin crawl." That kind of thing, where you're talking about physiology.
So, do you think that's one of those things in NLP where they think that people with certain systems use certain keywords to fit? Have you noticed that with the centers? People use?
Yeah. Oh, sure. In terms of sensory references, sensory predicates, people really do that.
Jonathan has looked quite a bit into the DSM. Have you looked into the DSM, Tom?
Now and then.
Yeah, they're kind of. I've definitely heard that Enneagram is better than it.
Well, they linked the Enneagram to various conditions in the DSM early on, and some of them make sense and some of them don't. And I kind of dip into it according to taste.
Me too, because some of it, I do think it helps refine the DSM a lot, but it's also that the DSM has its own problems.
Yeah, if somebody has social affective disorder, well, to me that just means they're a 5. I don't know.
Jonathan wrote that the description of the sexual 4 sounds like borderline personality disorder.
Well, I would actually say that borderline personality disorder sounds like, in different ways, it sounds like sexual 4, sexual 6, and maybe sexual 2, and it's borderline personality disorder definitely revolves around the sexual instinct. If you have that, you're almost certainly going to be sexual instinct, because it's all about your paranoia about relationships. So it's an unhealthy sexual instinct.
So guys,
that's a bit trickier.
I would really qualify this when you talk about it. And maybe in your thinking, make a distinction between when somebody's really healthy and somebody's really unhealthy.
Yes. Yeah,
that's something that's really important to remember.
Yeah. I mean an unhealthy.
So it's borderline's real unhealthy.
Oh, yeah. I have a question. Because Russ. What do you think of? I really like the core dynamics at the back of personality types. What do you think of those diagrams at the back of that book?
That's a book I saw 30 years ago. I'm not really sure. Is it a list of adjectives for healthy?
Yeah, you've got like, is that one that has like A terms, B terms, things like that?
I can't quite read it, but
yeah, I'll.
I mean, one of the things I liked about that book when I first read it was that it described a spectrum from really healthy to really unhealthy.
Yeah.
And that's really important to remember with this stuff, because otherwise you're just, you're talking about types and it's not clear. People feel damned, or they feel they're preoccupied with the limitations of the types or whatever. But actually each type has a bunch of capacities and talents and resources that are built in that come naturally to you when you work on it and get out of your own way.
So there you go. Can you see that at the moment?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
Is that okay? I mean, so
it seems fine.
Right, because I like it as well. I was just wondering if that you think that this still holds up, the way to describe the particular words chosen. Do you think they're okay?
Generally.
Right,
Generally,
okay.
I thought that was a pretty good book. I think they revised it when Russ came on board. They rewrote it to a degree.
I didn't know that. I thought he and Don Rizzo did it from the beginning together. But
no, Don did it first, and then Russ. When they went to do a second edition, Russ was on board by then.
Okay.
Yeah.
What I sort of taken from this is that the idea that in the core dynamics that it's really the this idea that someone's got they have the idea that you have the basic desire, then you've got the self-image, and their idea was that because the awareness someone has of themselves doesn't quite fit their self-image, that it creates that secondary fear, and it has the cascade of disintegration. But what is the mechanism for going in reverse? For integrating? That I would be happy if they put it the other way around, like how someone can go up the levels rather than down, because it's like, how do they then go up?
Well, when people are caught in the low side of their Enneagram style in adulthood, usually they're in a kind of trance, and they're in a kind of pattern of defense that used to make sense. It's something that once worked for them. It's something that is relatable to their early adaptations in life, and those adaptations were good ones. They were adaptations to whatever circumstances they were in, the kinds of family they were raised in, the kinds of pressures to be a certain way within the family, things that happened to them that were traumatic or painful or just confusing or confounding in some way, that they built subtle defenses against. And those defenses will come out in the form of the low side of their Enneagram style. And usually when they start to grow and change later in life, motivation is a factor, but also they begin to realize that their model of the world is not the same as the world that they're in, and that it's based on stuff that used to happen. And when things used to happen to them, then they started to do them to themselves. So a one who grew up feeling judged might be judgmental to themselves, or a 6 who grew up feeling scared might then start to scare themselves. And it gives them a quality of control. It gives them they can predict events that way, which is, one of the uses of something like an Enneagram style. And then when it's several decades later, they start to get dissatisfied with the limitations of their responses, or maybe if they were a 5 and they grew up in a family where everybody was emotionally distant, and then they have their own family and they understand that being in a family means being emotionally distant, but the people in their lives now want more contact. They want more closeness. And the strategy that used to work is now producing the opposite result. The thing that saves you is now the thing that gets in your way. And so when there's that kind of motivation or that kind of realization, then people start to want to go into maybe some of the aspects of their experience that they avoid, things that are shadows for them, maybe painful feelings that they locked away, or kind of getting focused on what they want instead of maintaining a status quo. And sometimes people will adopt like spiritual practices or meditation practices. And then there's also things like therapy and various forms of change work, various forms of methods that help you grow and change. And that's what they seek out and apply. And then with Enneagram styles, different things work better for different styles. But there are some general things that work well for all the styles. So it's kind of potluck that way.
What I can say for those people, that this book that came out after Personality Types does offer some advice for the types, this understanding the Enneagram. And I believe that this was written to help as a sort of guidebook to this. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you have the later edition with Don Rizzo with Russ Hudson. Yeah. And he wrote an earlier one that was just Don Rizzo.
Yeah. I noticed that in the...
I have a lot of things on my website.
Yes. Well, yes, and your website is, Tom?
TheChangeWorks, all one word, .com.
Right.
There's audio programs and videos and books and free information. Oh, it's wonderful. Operators are standing by.
So, Tom, what are your thoughts on the arrows of integration and disintegration?
I think they're totally misleading.
Because Catherine said something interesting. So, what do you think of? So, does that any validity to them at all, or what do you think?
I think that any validity is overstated and overformed, and that you have connections to them that are built in. They're like sides to your character. So if you're a 5, you have a built-in connection to 8. You have a built-in connection to 7. They come out at different times. They can be, depending on what's emphasized in your experience, they can be more prominent or less prominent. You can identify with them or disidentify with them, see them in other people. They're there. They're tensions. They are like, they're part of the sort of liquid mosaic of character that this thing describes. But they're mixed. There's a high side to each one of them and a low side to each one of them. No one is better than the other. No one is a magic way out of your dilemmas and the fix of your personality style. And no one represents disintegration, where if you go in that direction, you go mad. The disintegrating part has an integrating part. The unhealthy part has a healthy part. That's true for all of these connections. True for wings. True for you carry your parents' Enneagram styles. You have a connection to those. And then, like I said, the subtypes, they all have high sides as well.
So, Tom, if we go through which, if you'd like to talk about the Enneagram books that you've written and sort of a summary, then people can get to know more about.
I co-edited one book called Enneagram Applications, which is an anthology. It's got a lot of the Enneagram applied to a lot of different things, to spirituality, to business, to the arts, to movies, to literature. And then another book I wrote is the Enneagram Movie and Video Guide, which is about 1,000 movie reviews or allusions to characters demonstrating Enneagram styles in film. And then there's a third book that I'm sort of about 2/3 done, and I'm publishing it chapter by chapter, called The Dynamic Enneagram. And that's closest to what we've been talking about today, the integration of NLP, for example. Ooh. I sent you guys a couple of chapters. I don't know if you got them. But that sort of approach to using the Enneagram as a framework for growing and changing, rather than just using it to know about it and to speculate about it and to build more models, to really apply it, make it count for something.
I'd be interested in reading the chapter on the 5 about that book, the NLP.
That one's not quite done, actually.
Oh, right, okay. So, like I said, Catherine Farver described the arrows and integration and disintegration as an error that went around the word.
Right.
And
Claudio Naranjo was supposedly playing with them one day.
Yeah.
I just think people, Don Rizzo repeated it. Everybody in a Catholic circle repeated that error. It was learned from Claudio by a guy named Bob Oakes, and Bob Oakes taught it in Catholic circles, and then not quite everybody. Jerry Wagner didn't repeat that error, but Don Rizzo certainly did with directions of integration and disintegration. And I just think it's more about a model than it is about people's actual experience. Yeah. And that's the distinction you have to make. So
Elizabeth Wegley, who we hope to be interviewing soon, Jonathan and I, has talked about in here, in this good book for getting people into Enneagram, where she would say, so she gives an example of, say, the type 5. She would say things like, when the type 5 moves towards the positive side of 8, they act like this. When they move towards the negative side of 8, like this.
That's right.
So it's like positive and negative of like both directions.
Right. That's what I mean too.
And are you in favor of that approach?
That's my experience of actual people.
Right. Yeah. Right. So that's 3 people who agree with that. So Elizabeth Wegley, that is the veto. All of these systems, that's my experience with actual people. So bottom line of all personality theories, it has to fit real people. Right. Which is what I say to some socionics people. And then they tell me, yes, but I have met people who fit that. And I'm thinking, I need to meet more people then. So, Jonathan, have you got any questions?
Well, in fact, I didn't actually know that was a new book. I thought that was an old book. You were just doing some fart. Thank you. But when's it out? When's the book out?
What is that chapter?
Oh, yeah, but when do you think it'll be completed?
I don't know. I'll get a few more chapters out this year, that's for sure. There's a few more that are, and then we'll turn it into a physical book. It's mostly it's an ebook right now, and the chapters are ebooks. They're very cheap, though.
Right. Right then. Enneagram. We've done the centers, done the. Okay, so let's have a quick summary of if we go through the type. So in terms of representational systems, which types do you think are visual?
I wouldn't put it that way.
Okay.
It comes out more in the wings sometimes,
right.
But people are individuals, and then when you kind of get an idea of their sensory biases, it often makes sense in terms of the type, but you can't lead with that. You can't go in assuming.
Yeah, that's what I thought. That's what you get with these primary representations, where there are tendencies, there are patterns.
Right.
Where, so for example, in MBTI, those types that are extroverted sensing types tend to be kinesthetic, especially like ESFP, ESTP. And again, it's
5 with a 4 wing tends to be more kinesthetic than 5 with a 6 wing, for example. With a 6 wing, it's more visual and auditory, and the feelings are more cut off. Things like that.
Oh, yes. You're going, Jonathan.
Well, that's interesting because we know someone who's a 5 with a 4 wing and they're into bodybuilding, and they've got their own gym business and so on. So
there'll also be a kind of a wash of emotions and kind of more awareness of feelings. It's kind of like blending the technical with the aesthetic.
Yeah, so that's an advantage of, especially if someone is a type 5, it's good that they know MBTI, because then it can help them to decide, because a lot of 5s are either going to be, generally it's going to break down, they can find out whether they're an INTP or an INTJ, because that will help nuance the Enneagram 5.
Yes,
generally, as 5s grow and change, they get more in touch with feelings. That way, then other people don't have the feelings. The 5 has the feelings, and they find ways to kind of dip into their feelings and kind of manage them rather than cutting them off and dissociating.
Yeah,
and then they're more integrated, and everything works better.
Yeah, and like I said, when someone knows MBTI and especially socionics, you can get a nuanced view of the 5 as to when this really fits INTP, when this really fits INTJ. So, for instance, Tom, when I sometimes look at Enneagram Type 5, there's bits, that sounds like INTP, that sounds like INTJ. So, for instance, INTJ is a type that is known as in humanitarian socionics is FE break. That means they don't really care about what strangers think of them or like their public image. They concentrate on the truth, what they think, their personal convictions, and when they develop their feeling side, they develop the feeling side in terms of their own personal ethics and principles rather than the group thing. And then that might be the type of person that would get into NLP and learn to do like interpersonal things, but from the roots of, I need a public image. But the roots of improvement for the INTJ is to go toward ethics and their own personal conscience and things like that.
In NLP terms, that would be called being internally referenced.
Yeah. For the INTJ,
And then there's also a tension within 5s where they feel on one level they're internally referenced, on another level they feel like they can be influenced by outside opinions and forces.
Right.
And they're defensive that way because they're hypersensitive on one hand and they withdraw on the other hand.
Right. That bit that you said there about the influence, that's more INTP, because in socionics they model in the model of the INTP model, I call it TINX, it's logical, intuitive, introverts. They are FE, suggestive, manipulative, where they can be, and they go well with ESFJ. The ESFJ type is a lot of positive emotionality.
INTPs are more about other people's feelings, whereas INTJs are more about their own feelings. That's what happens when they develop.
Yeah, when they develop. But it's always, the amount of feeling the INTP has, it's like within constraints, is like in a certain, and another thing that socionics will have is like, Maria will say someone like me that when I'm in a hangout, and when the INTP is talking about something they're interested in and they're on their territory, they act a little bit more like an ENFP and a little bit more expressive.
Morgan 7.
Yeah.
I'm having to translate, I think.
But yeah. Oh yeah, gotcha. Good point. Yeah, and the idea that, and also there's a difference between INTPs and INTJs, and I've read this when I looked at the Linden book. Is that there will be those type 5s, the INTJ, that's a little bit more attracted towards danger and excitement because they realize they have to get out of the downtime, get more into the uptime in the moment, in the world, as a way to like get into the world. Or INTJs, that's good for them to get outside of their head, but not good for INTPs. The INTPs see that kind of being in the moment stuff as stupid, to be honest, because we see it as just too risky, and we avoid that kind of stuff. We just see it as stupid. to be honest.
Going towards the danger, sometimes there's an element that's related to the connection to 8. And sometimes 5s with a 6-wing will have a counterphobic 6-wing.
Well, that's the other thing, because I've had trouble with certain types. I couldn't determine if they're 6-wing 5 or 5-wing 6, and that's partly an MBTI thing as well, because with things like it'll be INTPs who seem quite counterphobic, and INTPs in general, even if they're not a 5, they will look like a 5. So that's one of the issues. So basically, in summary, if you're coming at this from an MBTI, if you're coming at Enneagram from an MBTI perspective or a sociologist perspective, you're practically a whole new school of thought.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a.
The models don't really represent the same things.
Exactly, but
they're complementary, like you say.
Yeah. The only thing is there is a blurry area where they do overlap and contradict. So it's So like just another school to add to the Enneagram method schools.
And then remembering what knowing this stuff is for. I mean, people get into it for different reasons. Sometimes they'll get into it and they'll get lost in the models, and the models will take them away from themselves, even though they think they're making progress. Yeah. And then, sometimes you find in these models somewhere a germ or a nub of truth that really helps you and helps you grow and helps you go beyond old limits and helps you kind of evolve out of whatever you were raised with, for example, and kind of go past your defenses and sort of open up in broader ways to the larger world.
I always think it's good that people have at least 2 models of personality. So they're not just looking at something through one end, so they have at least 2 different models, and then you can compare them. And because then you will know, this model doesn't cover what this model fits. So you at least know it's a model and it's an angle on the truth. So at least 2. And I suggest MBTI or Socionics and Enneagram. If you have those 2 with a little bit with NLP as well, those 3 things, that's pretty good. You're off to a good.
I often recommend, the model and the specific, type and that you recognize as the one that makes you kind of a little sick to your stomach.
Thing is, I actually got in that mode when I was reading about Enneagram 4, which is what I got on tests. I got really sick to my stomach a bit, and there's only later when I decided it's actually an Enneagram 1, which that's probably, which I did not get sick to my stomach with quite as much. That was more like, whoa, that's me, all that. Stuff. So,
well, there's the uncomfortable part of it. There's bad news, and then there's good news. Yeah. So and it comes together. They travel together. Those things.
Yeah.
Oh yes. Oh, here's an example of the benefit of knowing MBTI type. Enneagram type 7. Enneagram type 7 is a mishmash of. I'm not saying it's a bad mishmash, but it's a mishmash. There's elements in there of any DOMs, the extroverted intuitive type, and the extroverted sensation type. So we've done hangouts with someone called Jeff Miller.
Basically, type 7s in MBTI are usually ENFP, ENTP, ESFP, and ESTP, and there's particular nuances to them. That's what he's trying to say.
Yeah. Oh,
I know introverted 7s. I know a number of introverted 7s.
Well, no, what we'd say is that they might still be extroverts in MBTI because, like, ENTPs and ENFPs can be very introverted, even though they're extroverts in MBTI. That's the tricky part.
Yeah, it's how you define introversion.
It's more like what you're extroverted towards, what you're introverted towards. So, ENFPs and ENTPs are extroverted towards ideas and interesting things and so on, so they can seem quite
things in the world.
Are there extroverts towards action?
Yes, that's what we're saying. ESFPs and ESTPs.
I see it sometimes in counterphobic 6s, where the really counterphobic 6s are not very in touch with being afraid, and they'll externalize everything and jump into action. And they'll say things like life is movement, and it's important to keep moving forward. things like that.
Yeah, basically.
I always wondered about that.
Yeah, basically any SP type in MBTI, so ESFP, ISFP, ESTP, and ISTP, regardless of their Enneagram type, they will live in the moment. They will be in the zone by default, and they're not going to. They'll struggle with introspection a bit, but that will, very often, if there's sixes especially, that's what you'll see.
And that's why, again, as you said, Tom, when you can get to talk to real people. So, for instance, we know. I said the surname. We know Kristin. Kristin is Jonathan and I did a video with her. She's a 6, and she is an ISFP, and very interesting. Doing those two things going together. We did the Enneagram video first, and then we did the ISFP. And so that her being a 6 really did nuance her artisan temperament. So, for instance, she's a little bit more, she's less impulsive, I suppose. But for her, it's like she wants to have spontaneous kindness. She doesn't want to feel like it's an obligation. So she wants to do her charity work when she feels like it, rather than it being routinized the way with ISFJ. So
let's hope she does.
But yeah, I mean,
guys, it's a couple hours, and I'm kind of time budgeted, and I'm going to have to.
Me too as well, because I
saddle up and ride, as we say here in Oregon.
That's okay. I mean, so hopefully we've been okay.
I've enjoyed talking to you. Yeah.
Well, that is the bottom line. That is fantastic.
I hope you guys got something from it, and hope some of your listeners do too, and that anything that helps you kind of grow and change and open up and go beyond what you've known, it's to be welcomed.
Yes.
No.
Right. I think and I think this video will go together well with the Catherine Farber video, because we've gone into different areas. We've not just gone over the same ground. So.
Right.
Yeah.
Good.
Right. So that'll be about it then, folks. So it's goodbye from me.
Goodbye. Got to go to the bathroom. So.
Right, okay.
Goodbye.
I'm just going to stop recording.